The flight was running smoothly, passengers settling in, until one small moment changed everything. A flight attendant refused to help an elderly woman with her seatbelt, brushing her off like she didn't matter. But what she didn't realize? That woman wasn't just any passenger. She owned the entire airline, and by the time the plane touched down, the flight attendant would face a fallout she never saw coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The flight was nearly full, passengers settling into their seats as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. An elderly woman, Leora Wells, stepped onto the plane, her hands clutching a small purse as she moved carefully down the aisle. She wore a simple beige coat, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen a lifetime of change. Her movements were slow but steady, her steps deliberate, as she made her way toward the business class section. She didn't rush. There was no need. As she reached her assigned seat, she placed her purse gently on the armrest and lowered herself into the chair with a soft sigh. The seatbelt rested beside her, its buckle slightly out of reach. She stretched her hand toward it, her fingers curling around the fabric, but it slipped through her grip. She tried again, using both hands this time, but her fingers trembled slightly, making the task difficult. A moment passed before she looked up, scanning the aisle for assistance. A flight attendant, Cassie Monroe, stood a few rows ahead, engaged in lively conversation with a group of first-class passengers. She was tall and poised, her blonde hair twisted into a perfect bun, her uniform spotless. She carried herself with an air of confidence that often drifted into arrogance, choosing who deserved her best service and who did not. As she laughed lightly at something a well-dressed man had said, her gaze flickered briefly across the cabin, then moved past Leora without a second thought. Leora cleared her throat gently, hoping to catch Cassie's attention without disturbing the flow of the flight. When that didn't work, she spoke softly. "Excuse me, dear, could you help me for a moment?" Cassie turned her head, her polite smile faltering for a split second when she realized who had called for her. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable. She glanced at the unbuckled seatbelt and let out a quiet sigh. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am," she said with a forced smile. "You just need to pull it across and click it in." Leora gave a small nod. "I tried, dear, but my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Cassie barely concealed her impatience. She glanced around, making sure no one important was paying too much attention. "I'll be back in a moment," she muttered before turning away, returning to the conversation she had been having before. A young man sitting next to Leora, Ezrin Cole, had been watching the entire exchange. He was in his early 30s, dressed casually in a dark sweater, his sharp eyes flicking between the elderly woman and the flight attendant. He exhaled through his nose and leaned over slightly. "I can help," he offered in a low voice. He reached across and fastened the belt for her with a quick click. Leora turned to him with a warm smile. "Thank you, son." Ezrin smiled back, but there was a hint of discomfort in his expression. He had seen the way Cassie brushed her off. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A few passengers nearby had caught the interaction as well. Some exchanged quick glances, while others turned away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. No one spoke up. The plane continued to fill, the final passengers finding their seats as the overhead compartment snapped shut. The same flight attendant walked through the aisle, checking on passengers, but when she passed Leora's row, she barely glanced in her direction. She smiled brightly at a businessman in the next seat over, asking if he needed anything before takeoff, then moved on without a second look. Leora remained quiet, her hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't say anything more, didn't demand attention, didn't complain. But something about her stillness carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. A few rows ahead, in first class, a man in a dark suit observed the entire exchange. Callum Vance hadn't spoken a word, hadn't drawn attention to himself, but his sharp eyes took in every detail. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, His navy tie knotted perfectly in place. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a message. And just like that, the course of the flight had already changed. Cassie Monroe just didn't know it yet. The engines roared to life as the plane taxied toward the runway. Passengers settled into their seats, adjusting their armrests and flipping through the in-flight magazines. The air inside the cabin carried a quiet hum of conversations, the occasional rustle of pages, and the distant clinking of glasses from the first-class section. Leora Wells sat with her hands folded in her lap, gazing out the window as the aircraft gained speed. She could feel Ezrin Cole beside her stealing occasional glances in her direction, as if still bothered by what had happened. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his seatbelt before finally speaking. "She should have helped you," he muttered under his breath. Leora turned her head slightly, offering a small, knowing smile. "People reveal who they are in the smallest moments," she said gently. "No need to correct them. Life will do it for them." Ezrin leaned back, exhaling softly. He didn't know why, but something about her words made him uneasy. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, just certainty. It was as if she already knew how this flight was going to unfold. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Cassie Monroe moved through the first-class cabin, checking on the elite passengers. Her voice was warm, her smile bright, her entire demeanor different from how she had been just minutes earlier. She leaned down slightly as she addressed a well-dressed man in his 50s. "Mr. Blackwell, can I offer you another drink?" she asked, her tone smooth and professional. He nodded, lifting his empty glass. "Another whiskey, please." She flashed a pleasant smile. "Of course, I'll bring that right away." As she turned to head back to the galley, the intercom buzzed softly above her. The captain's voice filtered through the speakers, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign has been turned off, and you are free to move about the cabin. Our crew will begin service shortly." The moment the announcement ended, Cassie moved quickly to the galley, preparing the drink order. She poured the whiskey into a crystal glass, adding a single cube of ice, making sure it was perfect before placing it on a tray. Just as she was about to return to first class, one of the junior attendants, Mira Dawson, stepped into the galley, her expression hesitant. "Hey, Cassie," she said quietly. "Did you see the passenger in 7B, the older woman? She was struggling with her seatbelt earlier." Cassie barely glanced at her as she adjusted the tray. "Yeah, what about it?" Mira hesitated. "I mean, shouldn't someone have helped her?" Cassie let out a quiet scoff. "Mira, we don't have time to babysit every single passenger. People should be able to handle something as simple as a seatbelt without needing personal assistance." Mira frowned slightly but didn't argue. She had only been working as a flight attendant for 6 months, and she knew better than to question a senior crew member. But something about Cassie's attitude made her uncomfortable. She had seen how the woman treated first-class passengers versus those who, in her mind, weren't worth her attention. Shrugging off the thought, Cassie picked up the tray and made her way back to first class. She delivered the drink, offering another bright smile before excusing herself. As she made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor, she felt completely at ease. She had no idea that something had already been set into motion, something that would change the way this flight ended. At that very moment in the cockpit, the flight supervisor received an incoming call from the airline's executive office. His face stiffened slightly as he listened to the voice on the other end. The message was brief, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. There was a VIP on board, a very important one, and the flight crew's treatment of this passenger was about to be closely monitored. The atmosphere inside the cabin remained steady, the quiet murmur of passengers blending with the hum of the engines. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, serving drinks and attending to requests. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not to Cassie Monroe. She walked past business class without a second glance, her focus solely on first-class service. She had convinced herself that she had done nothing wrong. Helping an old woman with a seatbelt wasn't part of her job, at least not when there were more important passengers to tend to. But back in business class, Leora Wells remained calm, her fingers tracing the seam of the armrest, her expression unreadable. Ezrin Cole sat beside her, watching as flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, none of them paying her any attention. A few seats away, a middle-aged woman, Elaine Porter, leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Did you see how she ignored that woman earlier?" Her husband Warren Porter sighed, shaking his head. "I saw, but what can you do? People don't speak up about these things unless it affects them directly." Elaine pursed her lips, glancing over at Leora, who sat unbothered, almost as if she wasn't waiting for an apology or kindness from anyone. There was something about her presence that made Elaine uneasy, not because she seemed upset, but because she wasn't. She carried herself with quiet authority, like someone who knew she didn't need to demand respect for it to be given. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, inside the cockpit, the flight supervisor, Oliver Raines, stood by the radio panel, listening to the voice on the other end of the call. His face remained expressionless, but inside, he was processing the situation carefully. "Yes, sir," he said, his tone sharp. "I understand. I will handle it immediately." He turned, meeting the captain's gaze. Captain Miles Harding was an experienced pilot who had flown thousands of flights, but the seriousness on Oliver's face made him sit up straighter. "What's going on?" the captain asked. Oliver inhaled slowly before speaking. "We have a VIP on board, seat 7B. The captain's brows furrowed. "VIP? Who?" Oliver hesitated before responding. "Leora Wells." The name alone sent a current of silence through the cockpit. Captain Harding leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers against the armrest. "Are you telling me that the Leora Wells, the owner of this airline, is sitting in business class and no one on this crew was informed?" Oliver nodded grimly. "Exactly." The room fell into a heavy silence. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a major problem. The captain exhaled through his nose. "Has the crew been made aware of this?" Oliver shook his head. "Not yet, but they're about to be." He reached for the intercom, his fingers hovering over the button, but before making the announcement, he asked, "Do we have any reports on how she's been treated so far?" A pause. Then, one of the communications officers, Liam Foster, hesitated before answering. I received a message from one of our staff monitoring the flight remotely. Apparently she asked for assistance with her seatbelt earlier." The captain frowned. "And?" Liam cleared his throat. "And she was ignored." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the words settling over the cockpit. The captain's expression darkened. "Who ignored her?" Oliver turned to the passenger manifest, scanning the list of crew members assigned to this flight. His eyes settled on one name: Cassie Monroe. "Well," the captain muttered, shaking his head. "Someone's about to learn a lesson they won't forget." Meanwhile, Cassie continued with her routine, completely unaware that her actions, or lack of them, had just been reported directly to the top. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her name was about to be called over the crew's internal intercom, and when that happened, the rest of this flight would never be the same. The soft chime of the crew intercom echoed through the plane's service channels, cutting through the quiet hum of the aircraft. Cassie Monroe barely noticed it at first. She was too busy topping off a champagne glass for a first-class passenger. Her signature smile plastered across her face. But then, the voice came. "Cassie Monroe, report to the galley immediately." The announcement was firm but not aggressive. Still, it carried an unmistakable weight. She blinked, straightening slightly as she glanced around. It wasn't unusual for a crew member to be called, but something about the tone of that message unsettled her. Shrugging off the thought, she turned back to the passenger in front of her. "Apologies, sir. I'll be right back." She placed the bottle down and made her way toward the galley, her heels clicking against the floor. Inside the small crew area, Oliver Raines stood waiting, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his posture alone sent a message. This was not a casual conversation. Mira Dawson, the junior attendant, stood near the corner, shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Cassie entered the galley with practiced ease, but something in her gut told her to tread carefully. "You needed me?" she asked, forcing a polite tone. Oliver didn't waste time. "Do you know who's sitting in 7B? Her brows knitted together at the sudden question. "What?" 7B business class, elderly woman, silver hair, beige coat. His voice was clipped, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Cassie frowned, arms crossing over her chest. "Oh, yeah, I know who you mean. What about her?" Oliver's gaze hardened. "That's Leora Wells." The words didn't register at first. Cassie blinked, shaking her head slightly. "I don't." "The Leora Wells." His voice dropped lower. "The founder and owner of this airline." The breath caught in her throat. A heavy silence filled the galley, the quiet hum of the engines now the only sound. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her mind raced back to the moment when Leora had asked for help. She had dismissed her, walked away, ignored her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. She had ignored the woman who owned the very airline she worked for. The realization settled like a weight on her chest. Her stomach twisted as the full impact of her mistake sank in. Oliver watched her reaction carefully before continuing. "The executive team has been notified, and the captain is aware. They're watching how this flight is handled from here on out." He took a step closer. "I need to know exactly how you interacted with Mrs. Wells. Leave nothing out." Cassie's mind scrambled for a response, but her instincts took over. I didn't do anything wrong," she said quickly. "She was just struggling with her seatbelt. It wasn't a big deal." A scoff came from the corner. Mira Dawson, who had remained silent until now, let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. Oliver turned to her. "You were there?" Mira hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She looked at Cassie, then back at Oliver before nodding. "I saw what happened," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Wells asked for help, and Cassie walked away." Cassie's jaw clenched. "I was busy." Mira hesitated for only a moment before responding. "You had time to chat with first-class passengers." The words cut deeper than Cassie expected. Her usual confidence wavered. Oliver exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Cassie, this isn't just about ignoring a passenger. This is about ignoring the wrong passenger." His voice grew sharper. "And now, you're going to fix it." She swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists. What do you mean?" "You're going to walk back to 7B and offer a personal apology." Her stomach twisted. "Right now?" "Right now," Oliver confirmed. "And do it properly. No excuses, no attitude. If you don't, you won't have to worry about landing this job again after we touch down." The warning was clear. She had no choice. She took a shaky breath and turned toward the aisle. The walk back to 7B felt heavier than any step she had ever taken. Passengers around her barely noticed, some reading, some dozing off. But to her, it felt like every movement was being watched. As she approached Leora Wells, she felt a lump form in her throat. Leora sat quietly, flipping through a magazine completely unbothered, as if she had already predicted this moment was coming. Cassie swallowed her pride, steadied her breath, and prepared for the moment she never saw coming. Cassie Monroe stopped beside seat 7B, her breath uneven as she forced a tight smile. Her hands clasped in front of her, trying to appear composed, but the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her like never before. Leora Wells didn't immediately acknowledge her presence. She continued flipping through the magazine in her lap, her expression calm, almost indifferent. Cassie hesitated. She had spent years in this job, controlling situations with practiced ease. But now she wasn't in control. And the woman in front of her? She hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't demanded respect, yet somehow Cassie felt smaller than ever. Clearing her throat softly, she finally spoke. "Mrs. Wells, I wanted to apologize for earlier." Leora turned the page of her magazine without looking up. "Apologize for what, dear?" The response caught Cassie off guard. She expected immediate forgiveness, a simple nod so she could walk away and pretend this never happened. Instead, Leora's voice was patient, her tone almost amused. Cassie shifted on her feet. "For not assisting you when you asked for help?" Leora hummed softly, still not looking at her. "I see." She turned another page, as if the conversation wasn't particularly important. Cassie's fingers twitched slightly. "I didn't mean to ignore you," she added quickly. "I was." Leora raised a hand slightly, silencing her. "Think carefully before you continue that sentence," she said, finally lifting her gaze. The look in her eyes made Cassie's stomach tighten. There was no anger there, no hostility. But there was something else, something that made it clear that whatever Cassie said next would define this moment forever. Cassie swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing clever to say. No quick way to talk herself out of this. The reality was simple. She had dismissed Leora because she had assumed she wasn't important. Leora studied her carefully, tilting her head slightly. "You weren't busy, were you?" Cassie hesitated. "You had time to pour drinks, time to make conversation, time to check on passengers you believed deserved your attention." Leora's voice remained steady, not harsh, but firm. "But when an elderly woman asked for help with something as simple as a seatbelt, you decided she wasn't worth your time." The words stung in a way Cassie hadn't expected. She had heard complaints before, had even been scolded by supervisors in the past. But this was different. Leora's eyes held no cruelty, no need for humiliation, only the weight of truth. Cassie opened her mouth, desperate to fix this, but Ezrin Cole, the man sitting beside Leora, suddenly chuckled under his breath. Cassie turned toward him, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Something funny?" she snapped before she could stop herself. Ezrin raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "I just think it's interesting how you only care about apologizing now that you know who she is." Cassie stiffened. The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. Leora finally closed the magazine, resting it gently on the tray table in front of her. She exhaled softly, as if the conversation had already gone on long enough. "Apologies mean nothing when they're only given out of fear," she said simply. Cassie felt her throat tighten. She had expected Leora to scold her, to demand better treatment, maybe even ask for a formal complaint to be filed. Instead, she was making her sit in her own mistake, forcing her to acknowledge why she had really ignored her. Passengers nearby had begun noticing the exchange. Elaine Porter, the middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle, nudged her husband, Warren, whispering, "She's not letting her off easy." Cassie could feel the stares, the silent judgment. It was the very thing she had once inflicted on others. Leora's voice broke the silence again. "You should return to your duties, Miss Monroe." Cassie's face burned. I said," Leora repeated, "you should return to your duties." Cassie clenched her fists, her pride screaming at her to say something to defend herself. But she knew. There was nothing left to say. Without another word, she turned sharply and walked away, her steps quicker than usual. Her heart pounded in her chest, humiliation settling deep in her stomach. As she disappeared into the galley, Leora reached for her cup of water, taking a slow sip before glancing at Ezrin. "She's not going to forget this flight," he muttered, shaking his head. Leora's lips curled slightly, the closest thing to a smirk she had shown. "No," she murmured, her voice soft but certain. "She won't." What Cassie didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of what was waiting for her when the flight landed. Cassie Monroe stormed into the galley, her breath uneven, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her pulse raced with a mix of frustration and humiliation. She had been in difficult situations before, passengers complaining, supervisors scolding, but never had she felt so completely powerless. She replayed the conversation in her mind, the weight of Leora Wells's words pressing down on her like a vice. It wasn't just an apology rejected, it was a lesson she hadn't been prepared to learn. And the worst part? The surrounding passengers had seen everything. Mira Dawson, the junior flight attendant, stood near the drink station, hesitating before speaking. "Are you Okay? Cassie shot her a sharp look. I don't need sympathy, she snapped. Mira shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't back down. I wasn't offering sympathy. I was asking if you understand what just happened. Cassie let out a sharp breath, pushing her hands through her hair before glaring at her. I understand perfectly. I got scolded by some old woman who thinks... Mira flinched. You might want to stop right there. Cassie froze, catching the warning in Mira's tone. She's not just some old woman, Mira continued quietly. She's the reason we have jobs. She built this airline from nothing, and you dismissed her like she was nobody. Cassie gritted her teeth, turning away. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the truth was undeniable. Before she could respond, a soft chime came through the crew intercom. A familiar voice followed, this time with a weight that sent ice down Cassie's spine. All senior flight attendants report to the galley immediately. Mira's eyes widened slightly. That's not normal. Cassie stiffened. No, it wasn't. Seconds later, two other senior attendants, Nathan Hayes and Isla Grant, entered the galley, both exchanging silent glances of unease. Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor, walked in right behind them, his face unreadable. He didn't waste time. The executive office has just issued a directive regarding this flight, he announced. Upon landing, all crew interactions with Mrs. Wells will be reviewed. Cassie's stomach dropped. Nathan frowned. Reviewed? By who? Oliver's jaw tightened. By the board of executives. A thick silence fell over the galley. Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just about Leora Wells rejecting her apology. This was bigger than that. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. Wait, why now? She didn't even complain, did she? Oliver exhaled through his nose. Number she didn't. He turned to look directly at Cassie. But someone else did. Cassie's heart skipped. Who? She asked, her voice barely steady. Oliver's gaze didn't waver. Callum Vance. Cassie froze. That name carried weight. Callum Vance, a powerful businessman, known for his connections with the airline industry. He had been sitting in first class the entire time, unnoticed, silently watching everything, and now he had spoken up. Oliver continued. He sent a direct message to corporate, detailing how one of our crew members publicly dismissed the owner of this airline. His gaze sharpened. And now, everyone on the ground is waiting to see how this is handled. Cassie felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just embarrassment anymore. This was career-ending. Mira swallowed hard, casting a glance toward Cassie before shifting uneasily. Nathan and Isla exchanged looks, both suddenly aware that this flight wasn't going to end like any other. Oliver adjusted his uniform. As of now, I advise everyone to do their job properly and professionally for the remainder of this flight. He paused. Especially you, Cassie. Cassie clenched her jaw, barely nodding. Oliver turned toward the door, then hesitated before looking back at her. His next words were colder. Because when we land, you're going to have to answer for everything. Cassie's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had thought this was over. She was wrong. The plane cruised steadily through the sky, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had shifted. The energy felt different, heavier, as if something unseen loomed just beyond the horizon. Cassie Monroe stood frozen in the galley, the weight of Oliver Raines's words pressing against her like a storm ready to break. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way to fix this, to smooth things over before it spiraled even further out of her control. But deep down, she knew. This was already out of her hands. Mira Dawson remained near the drink station, stealing cautious glances in Cassie's direction. The other attendants, Nathan Hayes and Isla Grant, exchanged quiet words, both keeping their voices low. They knew something Cassie hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. This was bigger than a simple mistake. Out in the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice the tension. Some whispered, others kept their heads down, pretending not to hear the quiet conversations unfolding around them. But a few, Ezrin Cole, Elaine Porter, and even Warren Porter, were paying attention. Elaine leaned toward her husband, whispering, "She looks like she's just realized her life is over." Warren sighed, shaking his head. She should have thought about that before she acted like she was above everyone else. In 7B, Leora Wells sat comfortably, sipping her water. She hadn't asked for attention, hadn't demanded justice, yet somehow everything was unraveling around her. And she wasn't surprised in the slightest. Ezrin Cole glanced at her. "Did you know this was going to happen?" Leora smiled lightly but didn't answer right away. She tilted her glass slightly, watching the water swirl inside. "People reveal their true character when they think no one is watching," she finally said. "But someone is always watching." Ezrin exhaled, shaking his head. "She's panicking now." Leora's smile didn't fade. "Good. Let her." Meanwhile, in the galley, Cassie was panicking. She grabbed a napkin, pressing it between her fingers as she paced in the small space. "What am I supposed to do?" she muttered under her breath. Mira hesitated before speaking. "Cassie," she started, her voice careful. "Maybe you should stop worrying about how to fix this and start thinking about why it happened in the first place." Cassie's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me?" Mira didn't back down. "You ignored her because you assumed she wasn't important." She shook her head. "You do it all the time, Cassie. You decide who's worth your attention and who isn't. And today it just happened to backfire." Cassie's fingers tightened around the napkin, her jaw clenching. "I was doing my job," she hissed. "No," Mira countered, meeting her gaze. "You were doing your version of this job, and now you're about to find out what happens when you underestimate the wrong person." A tense silence stretched between them. Then the crew intercom buzzed again. The voice of Captain Miles Harding filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and cabin crew, prepare for landing." Cassie swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. Mira adjusted her uniform. "Better prepare yourself," she said quietly, "because whatever happens when we land, it's not going to be something you can walk away from." Cassie didn't answer. She simply stared ahead, her pulse pounding in her ears. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she'd even have a job by the time this flight was over. The cabin shifted as the plane began its descent, the subtle change in altitude pressing lightly against the passengers' ears. Overhead compartments rattled slightly, and the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the aircraft. Cassie Monroe stood near the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Her heart pounded. She could feel the eyes of her fellow flight attendants on her, their expressions unreadable, their silence heavier than any scolding she had ever received. She had always thought she was untouchable. Now she wasn't so sure. Mira Dawson, standing near the service station, adjusted her uniform, stealing a glance at Cassie. "You should probably sit down before landing," she said, her voice neutral. Cassie shot her a look but said nothing. She knew it was pointless to argue. As she slowly made her way toward the front of the cabin, she caught sight of Oliver Raines speaking in hushed tones with Nathan Hayes near the flight deck entrance. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could tell. This conversation was about her. Nathan shook his head slightly, his brow furrowed. Oliver merely nodded, his lips pressed into a firm line. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned his head and met her gaze. Cassie quickly looked away. She had never been one to avoid confrontation, but this time, the weight of consequences felt too real. She continued walking, passing through the business class section. Her eyes flickered toward Leora Wells in 7B, who remained seated, calm as ever, gazing out the window. She hadn't spoken since their exchange. She hadn't needed to. The damage was already done. Beside her, Ezrin Cole was watching Cassie carefully, his expression unreadable. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep moving. She could feel the tension radiating from the surrounding passengers. People who had once been indifferent to her presence now stole subtle glances, whispering behind hands, exchanging quiet nods. Cassie wasn't invisible anymore. She was exposed. She reached the jump seat near the front of the cabin, lowering herself into it with stiff movements. The moment she sat down, she let out a slow, shaky breath. This was not how this flight was supposed to go. She had boarded the plane completely in control. Now she wasn't even sure she'd be allowed to step onto another one after today. Across the aisle, Callum Vance sat with his arms crossed, watching the final moments of the flight unfold with keen interest. He had done what needed to be done. He had made the call that set everything in motion. And Leora Wells? She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't needed to. Some people demanded respect. Others commanded it without saying a word. Leora had done the latter. The plane dipped lower, the city lights below growing brighter, closer. The intercom crackled to life once more, the captain's voice steady as always. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Cassie Monroe gripped the armrests tightly. This flight was almost over. But her problems were just beginning. The landing gear deployed with a soft thud beneath the plane, the cabin vibrating slightly as the aircraft descended toward the runway. Passengers braced themselves for the touchdown, some gripping their armrests, others barely noticing as they continued scrolling through their phones. Cassie Monroe, however, felt every second stretch into eternity. She sat stiffly in her jump seat, her hands locked together in her lap, her nails pressing into her palms. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last. Would she be written up, suspended, fired on the spot? Number Leora Wells hadn't even filed a complaint. This was happening without her asking for it. That was what made it worse. Someone else, Callum Vance, a man with serious power in the industry, had made sure corporate knew. And when someone like him called the executive office, people listened. The tires screeched against the runway, a brief jolt running through the plane as it slowed to a steady roll. The captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. Cassie barely heard the words. Her mind was too clouded with panic. She wasn't stupid. She'd spent years in this industry. She had seen flight attendants get pulled for performance reviews that they never returned from. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she dared to glance toward 7B. Leora Wells sat comfortably, her expression unreadable, as if she hadn't just destroyed Cassie's career without lifting a single finger. Ezrin Cole, sitting beside her, checked his phone, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Cassie felt sick. The flight attendants moved swiftly to prepare for arrival, unbuckling their restraints, making last-minute checks. Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor, stood near the front, speaking in hushed tones to Nathan Hayes. Cassie knew better than to ask what they were saying. She knew it was about her. The plane came to a full stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Immediately, passengers reached for their belongings, the overhead compartments popping open one after another. Cassie remained frozen in place. Then, she saw them. Through the small window near the front of the aircraft, two uniformed security officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, their expressions stern. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. Security. She knew what that meant. This wasn't just a review. This was an escalation. A lump formed in her throat as Oliver finally turned to face her. His expression gave nothing away, but his voice was firm. "Cassie," he said, keeping it professional, "you need to come with me." Her stomach dropped. She stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She could feel the weight of the entire cabin's attention shifting toward her. She walked past 7B, forcing herself not to make eye contact with Leora Wells. But just as she passed, she heard Leora's voice, soft, calm, but carrying the weight of finality. "I told you," she murmured, not looking up from her magazine. "People always reveal who they are when they think no one is watching." Cassie's throat tightened. Because now, everyone was watching. Cassie Monroe forced herself to keep walking. even though every step felt heavier than the last. The murmur of passengers filled the cabin, their voices hushed but unmistakable. She knew what they were whispering about. She didn't have to look to know that Ezren Cole was watching, that Elaine Porter was nudging her husband, that even the first-class passengers, who usually paid no attention to what happened beyond their section, were now fully aware that something had gone wrong. And Leora Wells. She sat there, flipping another page of her magazine, looking as unbothered as ever. Cassie clenched her jaw, stepping through the galley where Oliver Raines was waiting for her. "Come on," he said, his voice neutral. She swallowed and nodded, following him toward the exit. The moment the cabin door opened, the cool air of the jet bridge hit her, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside her. 2 security officers stood waiting. They weren't aggressive, didn't grab her or speak in harsh tones, but their presence alone was enough. Cassie felt the eyes of every crew member burning into her back. Oliver stepped aside, giving her one last unreadable look before saying, "They'll explain what happens next." Cassie's pulse pounded. "Is this—" She stopped, realizing her voice had come out too shaky. She cleared her throat, straightened her posture. "Is this necessary?" One of the officers, a tall man with a shaved head, didn't flinch. "The executive board has requested a formal review of your conduct on this flight. You'll be escorted for questioning." Cassie's nails dug into her palms. "A review?" The officer didn't repeat himself. Cassie inhaled sharply. She knew this wasn't optional. Taking one last look at the plane, she stepped onto the jet bridge. The moment her feet hit the carpeted walkway, it felt real. She was being escorted off the plane like a problem that needed to be removed. Behind her, the cabin was still full of passengers retrieving their bags, pretending not to notice. But she knew they would remember this flight long after they landed. The security officers walked beside her, their presence making it clear that this was more than just a routine talk with management. Cassie wanted to turn back, to fix this, to explain herself, but it was too late. As she neared the terminal doors, she spotted a group of executives standing near the private meeting rooms. Among them was James Holloway, one of the senior decision-makers at the airline. And standing beside him, Callum Vance. Her stomach twisted. Cassie had ignored Leora Wells because she hadn't known who she was. Callum Vance had known the entire time, and now, he was here to watch what happened next. Cassie swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stay composed. She didn't know what awaited her in that meeting room. But she knew one thing. This wasn't going to end in her favor. The walk through the terminal felt like the longest of Cassie Monroe's life. The steady hum of airport chatter surrounded her, passengers shuffling to their gates, flight crews moving with purpose. But none of it felt real. The security officers flanked her on either side, not touching her, not rushing her, but making it very clear that she wasn't walking away from this. Her eyes darted toward James Holloway, the senior airline executive waiting just ahead. He stood tall, his sharp eyes fixed on her, hands clasped behind his back in the kind of quiet authority that meant he had already made up his mind. And then there was Callum Vance, the businessman who had witnessed everything unfold on the flight. He had been quiet, watching from a distance, letting Cassie dig her own grave. Now he was standing beside the airline executives, his expression unreadable. Cassie swallowed hard. There was no escaping this. One of the security officers gestured toward a private conference room, the glass walls slightly tinted for privacy. Inside, several high-ranking airline officials sat around a long table, their faces grim. Oliver Raines, her flight supervisor, stepped in behind her as she entered. Cassie felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just a review. This was a hearing. She slowly lowered herself into the chair at the far end of the table. The room was eerily quiet for a moment before James Holloway spoke, his voice smooth but sharp. "Miss Monroe," he began, flipping through a file in front of him. "Do you have any idea why you're here?" Cassie licked her lips. She hesitated. She wanted to defend herself, to claim it was all just a misunderstanding. But she knew that wouldn't work. They had already made their decision. She shifted in her seat. I assume this is about the passenger in 7B. James raised an eyebrow. Passenger? He tapped the folder lightly. You mean Leora Wells? Cassie felt her breath catch. James continued, flipping the file closed. Let's start with the facts. We received a direct report from Callum Vance, who personally witnessed your interaction with Mrs. Wells. He gestured toward Callum, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. Cassie resisted the urge to look at him. James leaned forward slightly. Let's be clear. Mrs. Wells didn't file a complaint. She didn't need to. Enough people saw what happened, including your own crew members. His eyes flicked toward Oliver, who remained standing near the door. Cassie's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. James exhaled slowly. Miss Monroe, this airline was built on one thing: customer service. Every single person who steps onto our aircraft deserves to be treated with respect. That includes the young, the old, the rich, the economy flyers. And yes, even the ones you assumed weren't important. Cassie felt her face burn. James leaned back. So tell me, Miss Monroe, if Mrs. Wells hadn't been the owner of this airline, if she had just been an ordinary passenger, would you have even cared? The question hit her like a slap. She knew the answer, and so did they. Silence filled the room as Cassie struggled for a response. She could feel her career slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, there was nothing she could do to stop it. James exchanged a look with one of the executives before turning back to her. We'll be making our final decision soon. Until then, Miss Monroe, you are officially placed on unpaid suspension, effective immediately. Cassie's stomach dropped. Unpaid suspension. Her worst fear was coming true. James closed the file in front of him. Security will escort you out. You'll receive an official notice within the next 48 hours. Cassie wanted to argue, to beg for another chance, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. As the security officers stepped forward, she forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. She had once thought she was untouchable. Now, she wasn't sure if she'd ever set foot on another plane again. Cassie Monroe stepped out of the conference room, her body moving on autopilot as the two security officers flanked her sides. The fluorescent lights of the terminal suddenly felt too bright, the murmur of passengers too loud. She had never been escorted out of an airport before. Not like this. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to keep walking. She had no other choice. As she passed the waiting area near the private lounges, she saw the last person she wanted to see, Leora Wells. The elderly woman sat comfortably in one of the plush airport lounge chairs, sipping a cup of tea as if she hadn't just witnessed Cassie's entire career crumble. Next to her, Ezrin Cole leaned forward, scrolling through his phone, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Elaine and Warren Porter weren't far away, stealing glances at Cassie as she walked past. She felt the weight of their stares, but it was Leora who truly made her stomach twist. Because she wasn't smug. She wasn't gloating. She was simply watching. And somehow, that made it worse. Cassie wanted to say something. Anything. She wanted to defend herself, to apologize properly, to explain that she hadn't meant for this to happen. But she couldn't, because she knew. It wasn't Leora Wells who had ruined her career. It was her own actions. Leora took another slow sip of her tea before finally speaking, her voice calm, steady. I hope this moment stays with you, she murmured, not looking away. Cassie's breath hitched, not because of the words, but because they weren't said with anger or cruelty. They were said with certainty, as if Leora already knew that Cassie would remember this flight for the rest of her life. Cassie's jaw tightened, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to keep walking. She didn't look back, because she knew if she did she might break, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing that happen. The security officers led her through the terminal, past the crowded gates, past the busy flight crews preparing for departures. past the world she had once belonged to. And as she stepped through the airport exit doors, the harsh reality of it all finally settled in. She wasn't just leaving the airport. She was leaving everything she had worked for behind, and there was no coming back from this. Cassie Monroe stepped into the open air outside the airport terminal, the cool breeze hitting her face as reality fully sank in. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, sealing her fate. The world inside, her world, had moved on without her. For years, she had worn the uniform with pride, convinced that she was in control, that she could dictate which passengers were worth her time and which weren't. Now, she wasn't wearing it at all. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, unlocking the screen out of habit. But there were no messages, no calls from anyone asking where she was, no reassurance from a supervisor telling her this was all just a misunderstanding. She had always thought of herself as indispensable, but in the span of a single flight, she had learned the truth. She had been replaceable all along. Cassie lowered herself onto a nearby bench, pressing her fingers to her temples. The terminal doors slid open every few seconds as passengers came and went, carefree, unaffected, moving forward. But she couldn't. Not yet. Her career had been built on a false sense of power, the belief that as long as she catered to the right people, she could do whatever she wanted. She had prioritized businessmen in first class, executives, passengers with fancy suits and expensive luggage. But Leora Wells? She had looked at her and seen nothing. And that was her biggest mistake. She let out a slow, shaky breath. Would it have been different if she had simply helped her that day? Would Leora have let it go if she had taken just 5 seconds to do her job? Yes. Cassie knew the answer. The old woman had never asked for special treatment. She hadn't demanded recognition. She had never even called for punishment. That was what made it worse. Leora hadn't needed to do anything at all. Cassie had destroyed herself. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench as she stared at the pavement beneath her feet, her mind racing. Could she fix this? Was there a way to undo what had been done? Then, just as the thought crossed her mind, she heard a voice. Software steady. Familiar. You're still here. Cassie's head snapped up. Leora Wells stood a few feet away. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't flanked by security or executives. She was simply standing there, watching her. Cassie's throat tightened. She started, then trailed off because what could she even say? Leora stepped forward, moving with that same quiet grace she had carried throughout the entire flight. There was no malice in her eyes, no trace of triumph in her expression, just understanding. Cassie hated it. She had expected anger, disappointment, some kind of final verbal strike that would solidify her downfall. Instead, Leora sat beside her. The weight of that simple action made Cassie's chest ache. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of car horns, rolling suitcases, and distant announcements filled the space between them. Then finally, Leora broke the silence. "You're not the first person to misjudge someone," she said simply, "and you won't be the last." Cassie swallowed hard, staring straight ahead. "I didn't." She hesitated, her voice weaker than she wanted it to be. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Leora exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "Didn't you?" Cassie flinched at the question. Leora didn't sound cruel when she said it. She wasn't accusing her, but she wasn't lying either. Cassie gritted her teeth, rubbing her hands over her face. I was doing my job," she tried. "I was just—" Leora raised a hand, stopping her. "You were doing your version of your job," she corrected. Cassie felt something inside her crack, because it was true. She had done her job on her terms, not the way it was meant to be done. She had decided who was worth her service and who wasn't. She had built her own rules, and now she was paying the price for it. Leora sighed softly. "You have a choice, Miss Monroe." Cassie hesitated, glancing at her. "A choice?" Leora nodded. "You can let this moment break you, or you can let it change you." Cassie's throat tightened. "And if I wanted to fix it?" Leora looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something. Then she simply said, "You start by seeing people, not just the ones you think matter, but all of them." Cassie exhaled shakily, dropping her gaze. Leora slowly stood up, adjusting the sleeves of her coat. "Good luck, Miss Monroe." Cassie felt the words settle deep, and as she watched Leora Wells walk away, she realized something. This moment would stay with her forever. The question was, what would she do with it? Cassie Monroe sat on the airport bench long after Leora Wells had disappeared into the crowd. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her like an invisible force, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The world around her continued as usual. Passengers coming and going, families greeting loved ones, business travelers rushing to their next destination. And yet she was stuck. The same job she had once walked into with confidence, with the belief that she could do no wrong, had now left her with nothing. For years, she had dismissed certain passengers, ones she deemed unimportant, ones she believed didn't deserve her attention. She had chosen who mattered and who didn't, acting as though her position gave her that power. But what had it really given her? A badge, a uniform, a job title. And now, none of it mattered. She had spent so much time looking down on others, and yet the person who had brought her to this moment, Leora Wells, had never once looked down on her, not even now. Leora hadn't gloated. She hadn't demanded punishment. She hadn't even needed to say much at all, because Cassie's own actions had been enough to destroy her. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench, her knuckles turning white. Could she come back from this? Would the airline ever let her step foot on another plane again? Her head buzzed with questions, but there was one thought that refused to leave her mind. Leora's final words. "You can let this moment break you, or you can let it change you." Cassie exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Was there even a way to change at this point? She had already lost everything. What was left to salvage? A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Didn't expect to see you still sitting here." Cassie's head snapped up. Ezrin Cole stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn on the flight. She frowned. "Why do you care?" Ezrin shrugged. "I don't, really." He walked over, dropping onto the bench beside her. "But I am curious." Cassie let out a bitter laugh. "About what? How badly I crashed and burned?" Ezrin smirked. That part was definitely entertaining. She scowled at him, but he didn't seem fazed. "Look," he continued, stretching out his legs, "I'm not here to kick you while you're down. You did that well enough on your own." Cassie scoffed, crossing her arms. "Great. Thanks for the reminder." Ezrin glanced at her, his smirk fading slightly. "You know, most people would have just apologized the right way and moved on." Cassie tensed. "I did apologize." "No," Ezrin corrected. "You apologized because you had to, not because you meant it." His words struck something deep inside her, something she didn't want to admit. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me ask you something. If Leora Wells had just been some random passenger, if she wasn't the owner of the airline, would you have cared about what happened?" Cassie opened her mouth, then stopped, because the real answer sat between them, thick and undeniable. Number, she wouldn't have cared. She would have walked off that plane, forgotten about the incident, and gone on with her life, never thinking twice about the elderly woman who had simply needed help. Ezrin saw the realization settle on her face and nodded. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Cassie let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through her hair. "Why are you even here?" Ezrin leaned back, shrugging. "I was waiting on a car. Saw you sitting here, figured I'd check to see if you had some grand plan for revenge or something." Cassie rolled her eyes. "Revenge? On who? Myself?" Ezrin chuckled. "Fair point." A beat of silence passed. Cassie looked down at her hands. "Do you think she was right?" Ezrin gave her a sideways glance. "About what?" Cassie hesitated before speaking. That people reveal who they are when they think no one is watching. Ezrin exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, I do." Cassie bit her lip. her chest tightening. "And what did I reveal?" Ezrin didn't sugarcoat it. "That you thought you were better than her." Cassie sucked in a sharp breath. The words hit her like a punch, because they were true. Ezrin studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "But here's the thing, people can change." Cassie laughed dryly. "Yeah? Tell that to the airline that just suspended me." Ezrin shrugged. "Maybe they're giving you a chance to figure it out. Not everyone gets that." Cassie blinked, his words unexpectedly heavy. She had spent this whole time worrying about what she had lost, but she hadn't considered something else entirely, what she could still gain. It wasn't just about getting her job back. It was about becoming someone who actually deserved it. Cassie let out a slow breath, her mind racing with 100 thoughts. For the first time since stepping off that plane, she realized this moment didn't have to be the end of her story. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something better. Cassie Monroe sat in silence, staring at the airport pavement as Ezrin Cole's words lingered in her mind. Maybe they're giving you a chance to figure it out. Not everyone gets that. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, that her job security came from the fact that she knew how to handle first-class passengers, how to make the rich and powerful feel important. But she had never considered the value of treating everyone with respect, not just the ones she thought were worth it. And that was the lesson she had never been willing to learn. Until now. Ezrin stood up, stretching his arms before glancing down at her. "Well, this was fun," he said, "but I've got a car waiting." Cassie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Yeah, I'm sure this was the highlight of your day." Ezrin smirked. "You'd be surprised. Watching karma work in real time? Kinda satisfying." Cassie shot him a glare, but for the first time, there wasn't as much venom behind it. He took a step toward the curb, but hesitated. "For what it's worth," he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "You could actually do something with this, if you wanted to." Cassie narrowed her eyes. "Do something with what?" Ezrin shrugged. "Your second chance." Cassie let out a dry laugh. "Right, because that's what this is, a second chance." Ezrin tilted his head slightly. "It could be, if you stop sulking long enough to figure it out." Before she could respond, he gave her a lazy two-finger salute and walked toward a black car idling near the curb. The driver opened the door for him, and without another word, he was gone. Cassie exhaled slowly, leaning back against the bench, her mind racing. For the first time in a long time, she had no plan, no sense of control, no clear idea of what came next. And yet, somehow, this moment mattered more than any flight she had ever worked. She pulled out her phone, staring at the blank screen for what felt like forever. She had expected messages from coworkers, from people gossiping about what had happened, from supervisors laying out the final terms of her punishment. But there was nothing. It was almost like she had been erased from that world completely. Her throat tightened. Had she really been that unimportant? Had she spent all these years thinking she was somebody, only to realize that no one actually cared? The thought sent a sharp pang through her chest. She could sit here forever, wallowing in what she had lost, replaying the moment over and over in her head, convincing herself that her life had ended the moment she stepped off that plane. Or she could take Leora Wells' words and actually do something with them. Cassie inhaled deeply, steadying herself. You can let this moment break you, or you can let it change you. She had a choice, and for the first time, she didn't want to make the wrong one. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she pulled up the airline's internal system. She still had access, for now. She scrolled through the directory, past supervisors, past co-workers who probably wanted nothing to do with her anymore. And then she found the name she was looking for. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. Mira Dawson. Of all the people on that flight, Mira had been the only one who had spoken the truth to her without hesitation. Cassie had dismissed her like she had dismissed so many others. But now, she wasn't sure if Mira would even pick up. But she pressed the call button anyway. The line rang once, twice. Then, to her surprise, Mira answered. There was a pause before her voice came through, cautious but not unkind. Cassie? Cassie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Hey, she said, swallowing her pride. I need to talk. Mira hesitated, then said, About what? Cassie looked around at the airport, at the passengers passing by, at the life she had taken for granted. She took another deep breath. About how to be better. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mira's voice softened. I'm listening. Cassie closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't the ending she had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.